Buon pomeriggio, good afternoon. Welcome to the Biennale Meetings in Architecture, which in this occasion is about shaping cities in an urban age. My name is Burdett. I'm from the London School of Economics, and together with Philip Rode, I run an organization called LSE Cities, which together with the Alfred Herrhausen Gesellschaft, as you'll hear in a moment, is responsible for a series of conferences and research which leads to the book which we're going to be talking about in a second. But much more importantly than that, or in terms of this event this afternoon, we have an opportunity to discuss a number of themes which are of broad interest, not just to those of us who've been studying cities for the last decade effectively in this program, but a wonderful opportunity to reconnect very closely with La Biennale di Venezia, and in particular with Shelley as one of the two curators of Grafton architects. Shelley and Yvonne, as you well know, are the directors, curators of the Free Space Biennale, which we are all witnessing. And one of the occasions, one of the reasons for having this discussion today in celebrating this book, but also celebrating a series of engagements over the years about these ideas of cities and architecture and the dynamics of urban change, is to investigate how free space and cities connect. And to do that, we're joined by two of the authors of the book, two of the participants in this collective enterprise over the years, the Deputy Mayor of Paris, Jean-Louis Missika, who is here, who trained and was active as a sociologist, was also involved as an entrepreneur before becoming tied up with Anne Hidalgo in a very successful way, I have to say, as in running Paris, and we'll hear from him. And José Castillo, a practicing architect, an urbanist, not unlike others, but actually does stuff and builds things in Mexico City and elsewhere, and is a teacher, professor at the Graduate School of Design at Harvard University. In fact, has been a collaborator with Philip and myself really for more than a decade, in fact, since 2005 in the Urban Age project. The format for the afternoon is not unlike the other meetings in architecture, which Shelley and Yvonne have effectively co-hosted. So we're delighted, Shelley, that you've come once again to this wonderful city to be able to be with us. It will be a series of short presentations by each of the individuals. I'll start with a few slides also which relate to the content of the book and some of the themes we want to discuss. We will have a bit of a discussion at this end, but we do want to engage those of you who have questions or comments from the audience in the later stage of the afternoon. We hope to wind up by between 4:30 and 4:45. That leaves some time to visit the rest of the exhibition and the other wonderful things to see around here before the show actually closes in the Arsenale at, I think, 7, right. 7 here and 6:30 at the Giardini. So let me start, if I may, by doing two things. One is that if 7, it stopped. Okay, we'll find out. Let me start by saying that at this point I would have passed the microphone on to the president of La Biennale, Paolo Baratta, and Paolo unfortunately is just not well. He regrets very much not able to join us. Some of us had a conversation with him yesterday, and I think we wouldn't be here together in many ways if it were not for Paolo Baratta's commitment to what the Biennale stands for, and particularly the notion of an exhibition being a serious and significant piece of research. It's not just putting stuff on the wall, it's an engagement, and I think the Urban Age project is a fellow traveler. On the note of the Biennale, let me also thank, on his behalf, he would have done that, Rolex, who has been the main sponsor of this extraordinary event and many other things. And in terms of our contribution of the Urban Age, as I said, it's a joint initiative between the Herrhausen Gesellschaft and the London School of Economics. But there are two people I want to single out now. This book would not have happened if it were not for Megan Groth, who has traveled here with her other production, which is a child, much more important and wonderful than however great we think our book is, and Rosie Havener, who has also contributed enormously, not only to making the book happen, but making this event happen together with Maria, Manuela Lucadazio, and many others from the Biennale. I guess lastly, I want to thank Phaidon, who are the publishers of this book. As many of you know, I'm sure you have in your shelves Phaidon publications from everything from architecture to cookery, and now there's a yellow book to add to the green and the orange of the urban age, which is, I think, significant in terms of an addition to our bookshelves. So that's sort of done with the introduction. I'd like to now turn to making my brief observation and comments on the slide. So if we could have the first slide, please. Possiamo usare... perfetto, grazie. I should have mentioned, sorry, that there is simultaneous translation if anyone requires it. You obviously use the headphones and the program, and it's from English into Italian and Italian into English if we require translation for the question and answer session. So I don't know whether any of you are using them, but please bear that in mind, by the way, for the translators to speak clearly and slowly. And when we come to the questions, it would be great if you want to, stand up, because we can't see you otherwise, and tell us who you are, and perhaps be quite brief. I know I'm in Italy, and that's maybe not one would normally say, but that would be good to be able to have the conversation. So going back to where I started, the Urban Age project is being summarized after, in fact, 7-8 years of work now in this new book, which is being launched today, which, of course, you can purchase at the Biennale bookstore from today, and it's the first time anywhere in the world you can purchase the book. So you will have seen, perhaps, already that it's present there. It's a collaboration, as I said, between two partners, between the London School of Economics and originally the Deutsche Bank's Alfred Herrhausen Gesellschaft, and it produced something called the Urban Age, and the Urban Age is a series of conferences, networks, connections, discussions, publications, exhibitions, and these sorts of events which are here. The last major one was held, in fact, exactly in this space. Jean-Louis, José, myself, and 74 other speakers were present. There were 600 people here over 2 days at this event, and it was a very exciting way to connect, in many ways, the Biennale with our own research. And we were asked by Paolo Baratta to actually put together an exhibition that we did collectively, then traveled to Berlin and to Seoul, and a version of it is now being exhibited in London, which is about what we call the conflicts of the urban age. So there's a deep connection, in many ways, as I say, between these two institutions that perhaps we can explore in a moment. What does this book really try and trace, and what are the issues we want to connect to? Well, the first thing is that urban change is incredibly dynamic. We all know the statistics. They're particularly familiar, I think, to everyone here. We don't need to go through them again. But just look at this diagram, and where you see in yellow, you see where the United Nations tells us there will be greater and more concentrated urban growth. And it's very simple from this map. In yellow, you see the concentration. Most of it will be in Asia and Africa. And take that diagram and reflect that in terms of the sheer numbers. We're talking about an additional 2.45 billion people, an additional 2.5 billion people. Nearly all of them, nearly 90%, will be going into Africa or Asia. So, you know, Europe, with the problems we think we have in terms of absorbing change, we ain't seen nothing yet. And even South America, Jose, has slowed down really considerably because its great period of growth was in the end of the middle and end of the 20th century. And one important point, which I think affects some of the discussion we may want to have, is that the decisions made by politicians, by designers, by engineers, and by architects are going to be taken actually in our generation, in the next 20, 30 years. So the decisions we make now, which affect the design of buildings, of streets, of transport systems, will actually affect the lives of many urban dwellers for generations to come. Now, you can't actually see the numbers here, but it doesn't really matter. What is significant that if you take all the top fastest growing cities in the world, the ones at the top of the list are nearly all in Africa, some in India, and a few in China. So the Addis Ababas of this world, Dar es Salaam, Luanda, are the ones that are growing at enormous speed. And I think trying to track how cities have changed are at the heart of what we've done in this book. Philip and I, as editors, with our, as I say, support from Megan and Rosie, were very conscious to use research to try and not just describe things emotionally, but try and be very concrete and pragmatic about what is actually happening on the ground. So this is a city like Guangzhou in China. You can see visually what's happening in terms of the eating up of the old and the erection of the new, in a way forcing into what's happening. But there's another way of actually depicting that, which is represented in the dark blue, in the dark blue, what Guangzhou was like only in 1990. It's not that long ago. And in the lighty blue, how much it's actually extended. The reach that it's actually multiplied is very significant. So that becomes one of the great themes of this book, is to address change. And change is completely different. This is José's city. This is part of the way the city has changed and grown, not only, but it's one representation of a city completely unplanned, effectively, in terms of its growth. There's another extreme where we're working on now, together with Philip, which is where the next Urban Age conference will be held in November, at the end of November of this year. Any of you interested in coming, just sign up to our website. We're holding it in Addis Ababa, where, if you saw the list before, it's one of the fastest growing cities in the world. And there, interestingly, there's quite a top-down intervention, exactly the opposite, in a way, of that, in trying to manage and structure growth so that 250,000, 250,000 homes have actually been built there in the last 3 or 4 years. So these are the extremes that we may want to actually even talk about. And in the end, a city like Shanghai is, of course, fascinating. It's the front cover of the book itself. How can you actually describe that change? Well, on the left, you see the level of density, how many people lived per square kilometer in 1990. So imagine the number of you sitting in the room now would be the lower part or middle part of that diagram on the left-hand side. And in the space of 25 years, that density, not the height of buildings, the sheer number of people living in the city has doubled or tripled, and you can see it on the right-hand side. So it's as if in the same room, we actually had 3 times as many people. We'd be a bit more stuffy and find it a bit more difficult to breathe, to be together. So there are many conflicting and parallel issues that anyone looking at architecture and urbanization need to deal with, and these are the major headings and themes that we've addressed in the book. Intentionally, they're varied and they deal with issues from as different as who makes decisions, issues of power, to issues of intervention, which I'll end on. What does the architect, what does the engineer actually do on the ground, but also what does a policymaker do? But the fact that there are constraints, that there are enormous uncertainties which actually affect what happens to cities is very much part of the story. We won't go through the 37 authors in the book, but there are some represented here today. And I want to stress this issue of data-driven, fact-based analysis, which is at the heart of our work. Some call it a bit nerdy, some call it a bit too much data. You're not expected to read any of this, but I think in order to actually understand change, one needs to understand what's happening in terms of, say, density we saw there, or even an issue that we've talked about at length ever since the Biennale, in fact, that I curated here in 2006. The issue of inequality was very much at the fore. Here you see this famous picture by Tuca Vieira, which has become nearly, a fetishistic image of inequality. There are many others that have been duplicated around the world. But what we try and do is actually map this inequality in different cities around the world. This happens to show London, Rio de Janeiro, and Hong Kong, with the darker colors showing you where there's greater concentration of inequality or deprived people as opposed to affluence. I think this is important to understand at the heart and behind what's happening. Because the reality, and I think we know this, and it'd be interesting to hear Shelley's view in the discussion, is that what's actually being built out there is more like this. It's more fixed. It's much less flexible. It's much less resilient to actual change and to absorption of different ideologies and powers. But even a city like Hong Kong, which has, in many ways dealt with growth in an extraordinary way, has its other side of the coin. It has the other side of the coin that the people who live there at the bottom end, this are Filipino domestic assistants, find space in what I think Jean-Louis would call an urban commons. Effectively, it's a passageway between skyscrapers to meet on Thursday evenings and on Sundays. And it's a very exciting sort of experience of what the city is about. Very close to one of the key arguments that Richard Sennett, a colleague of this project, in many ways one of the people that Philip and I started the program with, argues that the open city, the openness of the city, its ability to connect, is fundamental. And he has this interesting concept that no city is perfect. You'll always need to fix it, a bit like a human body. As it gets older, you've got to change parts. You've got to do stuff with it. And this is where I think there's a total connection with the notion of free space in terms of the open city. So we're interested in that, as we are interested in understanding what is fixed. And this statistic, the fact that most of the future of the cities that we're talking about will be built in the next sort of 20, 30, 40 years is important to understand. This is the stuff that's being built. But just look at this extraordinary statistic. In the USA, throughout the 20th century, the whole century, that number of cement, that amount of cement, I don't know what it is, but it's a lot. Right? No. In a few years in China, more than that was actually used. That's what we're talking about. And some of that is designed, and some of that is planned. And a lot of it is also conceived in terms of the structure of a city. This is a piece of development that hasn't yet happened in Lagos, but probably all of you in the room, certainly our experience here, will know what sort of city this is going to be like. We know it. We can feel it. We can see the roundabout. And we know that it will be totally dependent on private cars for many years in that part of the world using fuel, creating this sort of level of negative effects in terms of the environment. So beginning to wind up on the final sort of big themes that are in the book and that are going to be talked about by our panelists, I think you've got to talk about power when you talk about cities. And maybe we can reflect on the role of the power of the architect actually as that. And this gentleman here smiling and looking at his colleague and Anne Hidalgo. This is Jean-Louis and Mary Hidalgo at an event to promote development in MIPIM, it's called, in the south of France. Very interesting place where, in a way, the future of cities is transacted in terms of investment and power. But at the other end of the scale, as documented in one of the essays of the book, there is the issue of whose city is it? And sometimes demonstrations need to be organized, like in this city, like Venice, happens often, here, we're here too. Whose city is it and where is our voice? I think the issue of uncertainty has struck us over these last 15, 20 years. We weren't aware how uncertain the future of a city is. This is New York, you all know, when the lights went out in the southern part of the city, which of course has caused, and this is positive, an opportunity to actually rethink how the city might defend itself from floods, but not by erecting walls, but by actually living with the conditions of the water. That's something which is literally happening today as we speak in two extremely different parts of the world, which is important. So architecture plays a role here in the wider sense of the word. Who knew 15 years ago that, Jean-Louis, you would have to deal with thousands of people you didn't know would be coming into your city? And who knew that Tempelhof, say, this extraordinary airport structure in Berlin, would become an elegantly, efficiently designed refugee center for a certain amount of time in that city to deal with this problem. So the flexibility of the city is important. And José will no doubt touch upon this, but an earthquake is another occasion to really rethink the solidity of the city, but in more levels than one. And clearly I want to conclude with the issue which connects us straight back to an architecture biennale, an event that celebrates the making of beautiful, poetic spaces, generous spaces, spaces not just for the immediate user, but for those around them and elsewhere. And I think we have been encouraged over the years that not everything looks like this. Now, this picture may be a little bit unfair of a district in Jakarta, has all the non-Richard Sennett qualities of flexibility. Once this is built out, it will be very difficult to actually change it and adapt it to what will undoubtedly be dramatic changing economic and social circumstances of the people who live and work there. So that's something that we're interested in. And turning to the city, I've been fortunate enough to not only work in at the LSE with my colleagues, but also be involved in a project like the Olympics. The fact that it's a city that is very difficult to define, it's not as rigid as Barcelona or, let's say, as classically beautiful Paris, there is an ability to actually intervene and completely transform the geography, social and spatial, of what is happening to the east, the poor, the less affluent part of the city. And Jean-Louis, this is just one of the things I'm sure we'll talk about more, taking a motorway on the river and turning it into a beach. What an extraordinary thing to do. Gutsy, but also the city needs to be able to do that. And you can do the same as has happened in South Korea, or as we saw only very recently with the great architect Paulo Menendez de Roca, working with talented architects, MMBB, right in the heart of one of the toughest areas that I know, which is downtown Sao Paulo, creating a swimming pool for effectively a sort of workers' club. José and I were there only a month ago as part of a major prize award called the Miss Americas Prize. And we were just stunned to see what you can actually do, which does bring it back to sort of beauty, to elegance, but also understand how you can shape cities and through architecture and through good patronage to deal with the problems of today and in the future. I think at the heart of our book lies an issue which is significant, that cities not only need to be open, but are not fixed, that they're, being in Venice, it's a difficult conversation to have, because it is sort of fossilized by its history in many ways. We experience that as we walk through it and through the beauty of its monument. But to understand cities as iterative and incomplete, I think is at the heart of one of the themes that are at the heart of the book. So with that as an introduction, I'd now like to ask Jean-Louis Missika to comment and reflect on some of the contributions that you've made in the book. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Richard, and thank you for this invitation. I'm very sorry, but my English is not good enough to make an improvisation of my speech, so I am going to read some part of my intervention. You are talking of free space. You are talking also of open city, and I'm going to talk about urban commons. And I think that these three concepts are strongly related, one to another. And when we are talking of free space, about how cities can create places and opportunity for democratic engagement, but also ensure diversity, the word commons emerges as a necessary concept. Urban commons become more and more important as land becomes rare, public space full, and air polluted. How to ensure that those rival resources are still accessible to all and of good quality. And this is this rivalry between on resources which are at the heart of the concept of urban commons. A local government's duty is to preserve those resources for the future and to govern them efficiently, and that is not easy. The big equation for local governments is now how can we allocate limited resources in a context of already occupied land and exponential growth of people and real estate value. The attractiveness of a city is more and more based on the quality of air, its social diversity, and the access to all types of mobility. You can have nice office buildings, and a lot of cities have nice office buildings, but if there are no good areas for pedestrians, who wants to live there? In our essay, we describe some strategies that have been tested in Paris for developing urban commons. As you know, the word commons requires to go beyond our usual theoretical barriers, such as public or private property. Public ownership doesn't guarantee openness to the public, and generally it's in the public buildings that it's very difficult to enter. And some users are privatizing public space. The recent development of free-floating bikes and scooters is a good example of that, with some sidewalks being invaded by green or yellow bikes, while they don't pay anything for the maintenance of public space. They are free user of the public space. The Paris example is an extreme one in the sense that our city is both very small in its administrative limits, 100 square kilometers, and one of the densiest in the world, and also attractive and expensive. So what does it mean to govern the commons in such a context? Our global strategy is to extend the scope of commons in all fields by creating new spaces open to all, by sharing all the data, by imposing social housing in all private housing projects, and by giving back to pedestrian spaces that had been confiscated by cars. Today, I will present briefly two strategies, our approach to public space and our Reinventing Paris project, which changes the approach to private urban project. So I will begin first by the public space, and I will show you some slides of the Place de la République. I think it's a very interesting example of what you can do in order to have a more fair sharing of the public space. Public space, our belief is that no area of Paris should be reserved for a certain sector of the population, whether that be rich people or people who own a car. Public spaces get easily confiscated by a part of the population, by gender, by community, or by type of mobility. 5 years ago, we have entirely redesigned the Place de la République in the center of Paris, which was mostly dedicated to cars. The urbanist, TVK, have designed a space where all types of public feel welcome, from skaters to children who can play in the water. And you can see that in these slides. And after the Paris attacks or during COP21, the Parisian people have naturally gathered around that square, and now it is the starting point of all demonstration. You can see the demonstration after the Paris attacks, and this is an example of what happened during the COP21 event. And the strength of the square, of this square, is that it is undetermined and no use is imposed, and people can invent the use of the place. And the same as happened with the riverbanks. You can see here the riverbanks, which was a highway reserved to cars, which were dedicated to cars, and are now a promenade open to all publics. And you can see the difference. The difference in the center of Paris is very spectacular. Now we are extending this process to major squares in Paris, such as Place de la Bastille, Madeleine, or Nation, where we work with collectives that are missioned to co-design the square with the inhabitants. It is the contrary of bureaucratic urban planning. We now apply a principle of prefiguration to all our public spaces so that all users can be tested before being applied and so that citizens can have a word. But public spaces is an easy scenario where we control the project and can pay urban planners to implement a public project. But commons are not only about those situations. Our role as a local authority is not only to provide commons, but to manage the creation of commons by other actors, private actors, through a system of rules and incentives. In Paris, we are very demanding in our relation to real estate developers about the percentage of social housing. We impose 30% of social housing, the quality of architecture, the surface of green areas on buildings. All that is part of our local planning rules. But beyond rules, we need to foster architecture creativity and innovation in private projects, and that requires a more flexible local government. In 2014, we have launched the Reinventing Paris competition with that aim of developing innovation in the real estate sector and encouraging the private sector to create commons. We have chosen 23 sites all over Paris. I think I have a map. No, I don't have a map. It's not a problem. Very different ones from wasteland along the Windward to old mansions in the Marais. The simple idea behind this competition was to stop selling public land to the highest bidder, as most cities do, but instead to sell it to the best project. Teams could be led by any kind of structure, developer, architect, user, and the only obligation was to have an architect within the team. For each site, the laureate will win the right to buy or rent the land, depending on the type of site and the project. Based on the observation that the urban ecosystem was too segmented and too isolated from a wide range of respondents, such as startups, researchers, and artists, we asked for multidisciplinary teams that had to include organizations as different as emergency housing NGOs, urban agriculture startups, and neighborhood associations. This expertise mix guaranteed the creation of commons, because commons, the condition of commons is the diversity of expertise. This change of paradigm in the real estate sector, forcing developers to perform on qualitative criteria as much as on financial ones, led to new types of projects that were unprecedented in France and elsewhere. From the 815 expressions of interest sent from all around the world, the 22 laureates were chosen both for their level of innovation and for the commons they were giving to Paris. For some sites, candidates addressed a very local need, such as creating a park or a cinema. For others, the teams proposed a service that could be useful for a city-wide community, such as working space for NGOs or for artists. In most cases, the city of Paris did not impose the users and let the teams propose what seemed most relevant regarding their own project. For example, we proposed a site which was the connection between Paris and the suburb over the ring road. The teams could create a building bridge. The winning project, 1000 arbres, 1,000 trees, you can see here, creates an emblematic connection by installing 2 forests on top of the ring road. The bridge building will include housing units, offices, shops, and 2 childcare centers, and will provide a public forest for all visitors. In this case, it is clearly the symbolic power that convinced the jury. The ring road represents an advanced example of appropriation. Only cars have access to this space. and it is art for pedestrian to go across the ring road. It is an anti-common. The spectacular design of the winning project by Su Fujimoto transforms the vision of the road and enables anyone to cross the piece of infrastructure via a pleasant natural space. A second example on a very different scale is La Ferme du Rail, the rail farm. Here you can see it. That will take places on the edges of the orbital rail around Paris, a site that has been abandoned for a long time. The team is made of architects and local associations who gathered with urban farming startups and students to develop a shared space for their community. The architect co-designed a program that includes an innovative agriculture initiative based on local food networks and housing units for vulnerable people who will manage the farm. Here, the land was less valuable and the team had limited financial resources. Therefore, the city agreed to sign a lease agreement at a very low cost because the project had a social purpose. The jury chose this project for its sober architecture, wooden architecture, of course, which was very innovative in terms of ecological materials and for the social innovation it proposed. To ensure that this innovation won't simply remain at the stage of being good ideas and nice images, the city of Paris has included in all selling and renting contracts a 10-year clause on innovation and a 15-year clause on space use. Any change of use leads to a financial penalty if it cannot be justified. Several lessons can already be learned from this competition. Firstly, that raising expectations works. In a city such as Paris, where land value is high, developers are ready to stretch themselves in order to get a piece of property. The second lesson is that the creation of urban commons does not lower the value of land. The competition, by creating more rivalry and focusing attention, has ensured both good urban quality and healthy revenues. The total land revenues for the city of Paris exceeds 550 million euros. Some sites, such as the space over the ring road, won by the Mille project, have gained more values thanks to the competition and have reached a value that was not initially expected. Third, the quality of these private projects is a result of the trust placed in them by the public sector. There would not have been such creativity if as many rules as usual has been imposed. The administrative tradition in France is one of coercion and not negotiation. It was a big step for the city of Paris not to impose a program on a land plot. With Reinventing Paris, the city controlled the city controlled projects much more than before, but in a different way, more control a posteriori than a priori. Fourth, it works. We have already delivered 12 building permits issued from that competition, and 8 projects are under construction now, which means a lot in a city like Paris where projects are very slow. We are confident that all the 22 projects will be implemented. This competition has inspired other cities in France and around the world and is now becoming a new standard among urban policies. Since 2014, it has been replicated at other scales with Reinventer la Seine, a common competition between Paris, Rouen and Le Havre regarding innovations along the river Seine. Inventons la Métropole, a call for projects in the Greater Paris area with 59 sites involved. Inventer Angers, a similar competition in a mid-sized French town. Reinventer Paris 2, regarding mostly underground areas in the center of Paris. And finally, Reinventing Cities, a global initiative launched by the C40s with 15 cities around the world. In Paris, it has been decided that this way of operating should be extended. I'm sorry, this is the Reinventing Cities competition. In Paris, it has been decided that this way of operating could be extended to all land transfers to the private sector. All semi-public land development corporations are now encouraged to organize similar competitions, and even some private companies have been convinced to sell their land with those rules to participate in the public interest. This competition is inspiring because it opens a new scope of commons. In order to face major challenges such as welcoming migrants, we need innovative partnership. In recent private projects, the developers have included emergency shelters. Temporary occupation becomes a new standard for new areas. Experiments such as Reinventing Paris present a new way of governing that materialize in a new design, more flexible, more reversible, and more frugal. Negotiation and stimulation become the key words of local government. Commons carry the great quality of putting into question the usual dichotomies: public-private, temporary, definitive, citizen-ruler. They ensure that local governments become more agile and more open-minded. Contrary to natural commons, nothing is gifted in urban commons. There is no ideal original space, only spaces that can be improved. The move is from confiscation to communing, and not the reverse. In that way, there is no tragedy of urban commons, only a tragedy of non-commons. Thank you very much.
Jean-Louis, can I ask you just a couple of comments before we pass on to José? I mean, first of all, the title of your job is quite interesting, right? Because it actually links, and it's significant in terms of the what you've talked about and how you've talked about it. It links economic development and aesthetics, broadly speaking. Right? I challenge anyone in this room who comes from other parts of the world, not to mention the Anglo-Saxon world, where you find that job description together. That allows you to talk about urban commons, which, let me be tough about this, tends to be appropriated by a certain soft left discourse. It allows you to bring that notion of urban commons right to the heart of the key debate in cities, which is money and democracy. And the conflict has always been there, will always be there. It's not new, and it's been certainly around for thousands of years. What you described in your discussion in leveraging the private sector to contribute to the public good is, I think, quite extraordinary. So you say with the world map you showed, now these things are happening around the world. But I think, and this is my question to you, there is going to be a problem in absorbing the lessons. Let's say Lagos, right? That site, we saw that photograph of a piece of land, open piece of land, right, which is up for grabs for development. It's going to be very difficult to have that transaction between the public and the private in the ways that you described. So I'm interested to know, how did that job description start? Yes, because it allows you to have a discussion with the people who invest in the city financially, and to sort of plow it back in many ways to what constitutes the common good. You rightly refer to it as urban commons. And I guess as a separate thing, which we can leave lingering for later, you know, what does this mean for other cities? But just quickly on that.
Well, it began with a conversation between Mayor Hidalgo and myself. I was convinced that urban planning needs to have some link with the reality of the dynamics of the development of the city. And you know that what we call in the language of local government economic development is about creating jobs and designing the kind of economic sector or activity you want to have in your city. And in fact, I was in charge of innovation in the previous mandate with Bertrand Delanoë. And the strategy of the city of Paris is to create an innovation economy hub in the city, because we think that if you want to have a high quality of life, you need to have a high level of value creation. And the value creation is dependent to the economy of innovation versus economy of imitation. So we put a lot of money in this innovation hub we wanted to create. And my idea with this job description was exactly to make urban planning and architecture aware of this strategy in order to create projects. And I have not the time to explain all the projects of Reinventing Paris, but they have, all of these projects have something in relation with economy of innovation. And this is the main goal. You know, the main goal is that urban planning has to be related to something, to a strategy, to a global strategy of the city. And the strategy of the city of Paris is about this economy of innovation. And we wanted to make a relation between the two ideas.
Could I say something? I find this project extraordinary, and maybe at a very simple level, thinking about something like this happening in Dublin, we don't have someone like you. So we can't, no, we don't have a person like you. And I think this is really important in any city, that you have somebody who becomes the instrument and has the ability, because you're an ex-entrepreneur, I presume successful, and you act as the mediator between power and opportunity. And also the other thing that's absolutely extraordinary and unique and very simple but very radical is that the project comes first, not the developer. And this is the opposite to what happens. And these are two, for me, extraordinarily optimistic, simple but incredibly powerful ideas in terms of the status or the potential of architecture in the city.
Well, when we launched Reinventing Paris, the first reaction of real estate developers was a little bit negative, because they did not clearly understand the rules of the game. And I remember a conversation I had with one of the biggest developers about this competition. He told me, well, at the end of the day, you will look at the amount of the check. And I say, it's a bet. We will not do that. And by the way, only 6 projects on the 22 were the more expensive. All the rest was we choose projects which were with a lower bid, because the social proposal was more interesting. But what is very encouraging, I think, is that now in Paris, the developers understand the interest for their own activity of this kind of competition. Because with this notion of innovative approach, they can sell the place more easily. And by the way, one of the projects in the 13th district, they have sold all the apartments before the beginning of the works, and even for Paris, it's very rare.
Shelley, just one quick question. What Jean-Louis is also touching upon is that if a private client commissions something, a piece of architecture, as opposed to a public client, as long as the framework, the paradigm, as you said, is maybe appropriate, you will get very good architecture. You can get, and very good public space. Do you know how many of the projects that you invited in the 70 plus in your show, in Giardini and Arsenale, are public or private? Do you happen to know?
I don't know statistically, but some of the ones I'm showing, oh my God, maybe 50, being optimistic.
Okay, well,
Worth thinking about. Actually, your database, which you said you didn't think was a good idea, I think it's a very good idea. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Jean-Louis. Thank you for that excellent contribution. So, if we can now pass on to José Castillo, who will talk about some of his reflections of operating as an architect, but also as a mediator, perhaps, in the city of Mexico City, which is undergoing a very, very dramatic and important change. I'll give a little bit of his main story now, only to get the limelight here, that the mayor of that city, at the time that we held our Urban Age conference, López Obrador only very recently became the president of the country, ...
Thanks, Ricky. Thanks, Shelley, Jean-Louis. This actually, just for information, the images in the background will just be a visual cue to some of the topics I'd like to reflect on. And in a way, this is a circle that has gone on for almost 13 years. It's almost to the day 13 years ago that Ricky, Burdett, and Philip Roth came to Mexico City, and we embarked on a tour, which then became sort of a visit to Mexico City through the Urban Age Conference. And two of the sites I will show, and two of the projects I will show today, are very much connected to that 13-year history. And I'd like to reflect on that because I think it covers a dual agenda. One agenda which is very much at the center of the book, which is how do we shape cities? Who gets to shape cities? And another one which relates to the agenda of this Biennale, which is the notion of free space and freedom to transform space requires some qualifications of who gets to decide, who gets to be the recipient of that freedom. Is it the user? Is it the architect? Is it the public in general? This fantastic photograph of Brasilia in the making is really at the core of what I raise in the essay in the book. And Ricky has already mentioned that Latin America, of all the continents, is the most urbanized at over 80% urbanization rate, but also one in which, in spite of this urbanization, we are either suffering or living the conflicts of those processes. In the 1960s, the British architect John Turner decided to do what he called his de-education. He was trained as an architect at the Architectural Association, but he decided to move to Lima, Peru, to look at the barriadas and the informal settlements in Lima. And actually, he published later, in the beginning of the 70s, a fantastic book called Freedom to Build. And it's interesting that the book is looking at what's happening at the informal settlements as a solution to the challenges of urbanization in Latin America at that time. It is outside of architecture, outside of planning as we know it, where actually freedom could take place. The essay I wrote, in a way, addresses some of these historical challenges of planning in Latin America. We used to believe that planning, both as a political project, but also as a technocratic project, could resolve the problems of cities. And usually planning is understood as what this image represents. A bunch of white men in jackets and ties pointing to a big model. we can easily understand what's absent here and what's wrong with the picture. There's no women, there's no citizens, there's no deliberative process of what the city should look like. This, by the way, it is the president and the mayor and the chief city architects presenting the project of the National University in Mexico City, one of the most amazing pieces of architecture in the 20th century in Mexico. But what we don't get to understand is that planning always has its discontents. It's on its audience which has not been taken care of. It's citizens who are not willing to deal with the unintended consequences of a particular choice. And this has happened historically, even in the best and in the most successful pieces of architecture. So when we look at this campus, we are not looking at what happened when the campus was moved from the historic center to the peripheries of the city, and how that move represented a decline in the historic center of the city, which we're still facing to our days. So in the essay, I present what I called 4 pathologies of planning in Latin America. Though I focus mostly in Mexico, I explained how these relate to the whole continent. They're not pathologies exclusive to the continent, but we can relate it to some of the most relevant contemporary projects of planning today. One issue I talk about is the paradox of the tyranny of size. We are always caring to the big project, the notion of what Rem called bigness, or of the problems of the large piece of architecture and the large scale of planning. We tend to confound that bigger, whether bigger is always better, and whether big is actually solving the problems of what the city and citizens really need. So the question when we look at this photograph of the National University is whether it would have been better to build one single large university or to actually develop a number of decentralized campus. These questions are still at the core of some of the most challenging problems in Latin American cities today. And bigness is taking a big role even to our days. The second pathology is what I call the pathology of the immediate. We're looking at projects which need to be implemented in very short time frames, usually political cycles. Because up until recently, in most of Latin America, because of its complex relationship with authoritarian rule and dictatorships, re-election was not a possibility. This meant that in the 4 to 6 year cycles, usually governments try to implement every single project in those cycles. When you look at some of the most important pieces of architecture going on in our continent today, they're being built in these very immediate cycles. This, as we know, is not necessarily good for democracy. It is not necessarily good for the projects. Even in some of the successes, such as the Mi Teleférico or the cable carways in Bolivia, these are projects which could have not been done without, on the one hand, a strong leadership, and let's call it a quasi-autocratic rule, in this case by the president Evo Morales, but on the other hand, within the traditional processes of democratic planning, such as European countries have to face, which have to do with accountability, which have to do with participatory process. The third pathology I'd like to talk about is a pathology of misguided ideas. Why are we still replicating forms of infrastructure building which have been proven toxic or misguided in other latitudes or in other moments? I'm not showing the image, but the elevated highways that have been built in many of these cities in Latin America is a perfect example. Knowing what we know about urban mobility, knowing what we know about the problems induced by the privilege of the private car, it is still a mystery why we keep on implementing this kind of projects. And finally is what I call the pathology of exceptionality. And exceptionality is the other side of the coin of the misguided ideas, is that we are in Latin America, but very precisely in Mexico, we are hesitant to learn from the successes of other cities, such as the case that Jean-Louis was explaining with Reinvent Paris, because we think we are, in a chauvinistic way, unique and exceptional. This, by the way, was used as a technique to apologize for the particular kind of semi-democratic, semi-autocratic rule in the Americas for many time. We don't need to learn from liberal democracy of Europe or the US. We are our own particular idiosyncrasy that in terms of planning, this is the barrier for more successful ideas, whether it is bike sharing or whether it is a deep commitment by the state to invest in public infrastructure. So these pathologies get played out in many ways. I like to talk about the cycle of 13 years since we first visited Mexico City with Ricky and Philip, and to see how two of those sites are being played out through the lens of these four typologies. When we visited Mexico City, along with the Urban Age tribe, we visited one of the most dramatic gated communities, which is called Bosques de Santa Fe, up on the hills, almost 500 meters above the plateau of most of Mexico City level. And this is the most dramatic case of urban design used as a system of exclusion. So, in a way, geography, a ravine and a mountain and a tunnel becomes a geography of exclusion, not unlike the favelas and the Paraisopolis picture that you showed earlier, Ricky. But just outside this area, we used to have what was a quarry and a land dump, a waste field, that has now been recently transformed into one of the most important urban parks in Mexico City, which is called La Mexicana. So this site, through a complex and I would almost say paralegal system of planning, which was an agreement between those very rich people living inside this community, dealing in a sometimes not so open process of negotiating with the city and with developers, decided to reserve 70% of this site to build actually a quite fantastic park with lakes, auditoriums, restaurants. This is a site you can actually look at the right. This is more or less how the site was seen when we first visited 13 years ago. And the left side of the picture is it is a site as it is right now. The exchange, the quid pro quo between developers and city is that the developers would pay for the park as long as they could build 3,000 units of high-end residential. No social housing, by the way, here, which is still at the core of the problem. But this is a mode of planning which is existing at the margins of what's normal, which is, on the one hand, harnessing forms of innovation and producing outcomes which, in spite of its own problematics, are transforming cities and shaping cities with some positive effects. The other side of the coin, and of course this is a polemic project for all we can say, because it is right in the smack of the most upper end class piece of the city. So you could say that even though it is not done with a single cent from taxpayers, the focus and investment, at least the commitment from planning agencies, it is happening in a site where it is probably not needed, but where it is possible to implement. So this is a kind of a discontent of planning, and this is why it is a a polemic project. The other, and probably even more dramatic polemic, is the case of the new Mexico City Airport, a site which we also visited 13 years ago with the Urban Age group. The result of a competition and a planning process which has gone on and off for almost 20 years. Norman Foster and Fernando Romero won the competition to decide to build this project right in the center of an empty part of the city called Texcoco Lake, which is the lake bed of the former lake bed of the site of Mexico, Tenochtitlan, the city founded 700 years ago. What's remarkable about this project is that with all its problems, whether it is lack of accountability, environmental impact, dubious social and inclusionary processes of participation, lack of clear procurement, over 85% of the commission of the bidding processes have been direct commissions rather than any kind of bidding or competing processes. It is a project where $6 billion have already been put in place. So it is at 35–40% of construction. And 1 month ago, the new president, which used to be the former mayor, decided to call a public inquiry and a referendum to decide to pursue the project or not. So this is a site as it is right now. And it will most likely, in a month and a half, the whole nation will vote, and so forth, with a yes or a no to continue this project. So when the former, the German commissioner in charge of the redevelopment of Tempelhof, which we brought to Mexico City, was telling us about the cancellation of the project in Tempelhof, whether he considered that a success or a failure, he mentioned something which is relevant to this, is that sometimes the democratic successes are failures for planning and architecture. The question here is whether a late consultation, a late referendum, could be the equivalent of, let's call it a planning Brexit, a moment in which, without the rational and with the rational debate and without the information, we can decide to move backwards in pieces of infrastructure which are necessary for the city. This is the dramatic aspect of this project and its possible cancellation. It is not in the fact that it is Norman Foster or Fernando Romero. It is not in the fact that it is necessarily on the bottom of a lake bed, but actually in the way that sometimes the processes of planning have not had the actual match with the processes of democracy and accountability. Even the ways that we have channeled protest, whether it's through the machete-yielding protesters of 20 years ago, or whether it is some other forms of protest as they are right now, the real challenge is to see how those decisions from the public agencies and the planning technocrats, from the architects and designers, but also through the citizens themselves, can actually bring better ways of shaping the city. This fantastic lake, which we all visited 13 years ago when we started at the lakefront, it is being dried up right now. So that fantastic piece of hydrological infrastructure is going to disappear because of the airport. I end with this idea of power, which, Ricky, you mentioned. We have moved from the idea of the powerful, those who can shape the cities, to this idea of empowered, how the citizens and how do architects reassess and reassemble the notion of how do we talk with each other and how we deal with our antagonisms in shaping the cities. William James, the father of pragmatism, who has this phrase, there are no things but things in the making, we should think in that way about cities. There are no cities, but cities in the making. How and how do we continue making those cities?
But given this project that you've just shown, in a way you're presenting a positive view that Mexico City is in such a state of flux, such a democratic deficit at one level, everything goes, historically anyway, a very large percentage of informal development outside the planning system. There's part of your story which is quite optimistic, it seems. There's part of it. There's another part where you're ending, which is that the top-down only serves a particular constituency or a series of interest groups. Tell us more, where do you sit on that? Because I'm not sure what I'm supposed to take away, because the Santa Fe project, in a way, which we saw as and has been used by the Urban Age as the poster child of exclusion, right? In a way, has turned into giving something back to the city, but without anyone ever planning that, right? It's exactly the opposite of what you're doing, Jean-Louis. Right? You're trying to plan that level of inclusion. So, don't sit on the fence.
You remember the Groucho Marx saying, these are my principles, and if you don't like them, I have another set. I think that part of and this is more of a personal confession, that part of the challenge that we've had to face is that because we're operating in this dual role in which we lead a 50-person office, engaging some of these projects, needing to do things and to design the things, but also we have our own lives as academics and intellectuals trying to infer these decisions. We are reinventing the way that design can improve on those processes, but also we are, through our kind of academic or intellectual work, we're trying to infer and reassess those processes themselves. So we're dealing with both hands, and sometimes for better and sometimes for worse. So sometimes we have to deal with those challenges of immediacy. Sometimes we have to deal with those challenges of bigness.
So in that sense, this is requiring you to do, and this perhaps you might want to comment on this, Jean-Louis, is that you trained in the conventional way an architect is trained at Graduate School of Design, et cetera, 15 years ago, or 20 years ago rather than now. You have had to, in a way, develop the skills set to understand these much more complex processes in order to operate also as an architect. Turning to, let's call it my perhaps slightly critical view of French architecture, which for a good 25 years has held on to the symbolic and the iconic and the grand, right? No names mentioned, right? No, but I mean, in a way, that's been the sort of tradition from a little bit the Mitterrand era on, and that's maybe unfair, particularly if I think of Lacaton Vassal and more recent architectural practices. Are you finding it difficult, Jean-Louis, to get the architectural community to do what José is having to do in terms of think slightly outside the aesthetic box? Can you pass them?
Well, I think that we are now, we have in Paris a new generation of architects, and more interested by users than by form. I think that they are also aware that their role is more and more a role of coordinating a lot of knowledges. Exactly what I've said in my paper about the multidisciplinary teams. I think that the face-to-face between the architect and the developer is one of the worst thing you can find in urban projects for the future, because these projects, for example, have to deal with climate change, so you need climatologists and you need people aware of energy, renewable energy. When you are working on vegetalization, which is one of the most important stake for the future of the cities because of the global warming, you need some people specialize on this side, and by the way, architects are not so specialized on these subjects. And so I think that the future is in what we can call collaborative urban projects. And of course, in the collaboration, you have to put the citizen, the neighborhood, but you have to be aware that it's very difficult to design, to say who are the people who can have a word on a project. In Paris, when you launch a project, all the people around are against, because they think that it will change their life and not in the good direction. And it takes a lot of time to explain why it could be useful. But you have also to have the point of view of the future users of the place. And I think that temporary urban planning is very important because of that, because you can have future users during the temporary use.
I think, and just to connect to something that Jean-Louis only said, in a way the project is in itself an explanation, and the process is in itself an explanation. Some of the most fantastic projects that we see along the Arsenale are, let's say, pedagogies of those negotiation process. And I think, of course, Ricky has put me on the spotlight and asking me which side of the fence you start with. And I think that it is important to say that with all the problems that those two projects have, whether it is a park for the rich, paid by the rich without any kind of accountability, or whether it is an airport which has corruption, overrun of costs, and a high environmental impact, it is important to fix the problems of the problems of planning and the problems of democracy are fixed with more planning and with more democracy rather than with less planning and less democracy. And I think that's where we have to commit. When we look at the perceptions that most architects do have to the resistance to the airport project is like the screw participation, screw inclusionary processes. We stand in a different way. We believe we need to reimagine those terms of engagement and those terms of using the design as the technique to make participation more strategic.
More planning, more democracy.
Well, I want also stress one point, which is the lasting of the big projects. Maybe you are aware of this conflict in France about an airport at Notre-Dame-des-Landes, the airport of the city of Nantes. And we have some ecologists who are living there and fighting with the police against the building of this airport. And it had lasted 20 years. But I think the main subject is that this airport has been launched 40 years ago. The project of the airport 40 years ago, and the public discussion and decision have been taken 20 years ago. And so the question is, how can you organize a deliberation which is in real time? Because, and they organize a referendum at that place, and the people say yes to the airport, and the government finally decided not to do it because, in fact, it was impossible to do it without killing people. So I think that first, referendum is the worst solution. Not only for Brexit, but also for this kind of decision, because it's never a yes or no question. And secondly, you need to use new technology, new digital technology, GovTech and civic tech things in order to organize a new kind of deliberation and conversation between experts, politicians and citizens, and we have these tools. We have to learn how using these tools, because I think that the main question is today the concertation is biased. When I go to a meeting on a big project, for example on Montparnasse or on Bercy in Paris, the people in the room, they are always the same. 70 years old, or activists. But the true Parisian, the guy or the girl who is living the block around, they are not there because they have kids, they have work, they don't have time to go at 6 p.m. to a meeting with the deputy mayor. So the people I am talking to are not the right people. This is the problem.
Let's move to the final presenter, Shelley. Shelley is going to talk a little bit about the notions behind free space, which have informed the exhibition itself, and connect by looking at 2 or 3 projects here in the exhibition, connect the 2 themes effectively of shaping cities and also free space. I have to say that I'm in a unique situation as an individual, being both a member of the Grafton Architects fan club and also being a client, because a few years ago we ran a competition at London School of Economics and Grafton Architects are doing the building, so it's an interesting relationship to have, and we'll see where that ends up. But it's wonderful to have Shelley. So, José, thank you very much. If we can thank José. And
thank you. It's in a way, it's a pity to interrupt a conversation which was mounting in passion. I just want to speak a little bit about free space, which might sound quite simple in a sense, given the range of the discussion to date. But what we were really thinking about when we chose this theme for the Venice Biennale was how we could express our values as architects and as curators, which is what Paolo Barata asked us to do, to make an exhibition which would express our values. And we thought about our experience as architects and the most important discoveries that we have made. And again, they're very simple discoveries that at the core of architecture is a sense of generosity. And at the core of architecture is a sense of humanity. And that architecture has the capacity to, and many of the speakers have spoken about this already at the scale of city, but at whatever you spoke, José, about the tyranny of scale, we actually don't believe that there is a limit in scale in terms of thinking, that the small scale can accommodate can embrace the universal, and strategic thinking has to embrace the day-to-day life of the individual. And that's why we asked participants to think about how architecture expresses and addresses what we called the unspoken wishes of strangers. We also asked participants to think about how we use resources, what we called the free gifts of nature, and how our responsibility is to very often make what's not requested. What is the additional thing that we as architects can invent and contribute? The unprogrammed space, the democratic space. I have to say that the work that long before we met, that the LSE and Ricky Burdett and Richard Sennett have been doing has profoundly affected us, even though we're not, let's say, active urbanists, but in thinking about making buildings in cities and this whole thing of the open city. And I suppose the other thing, which I suppose I was referring to in relation to Jean-Louis placing the project before the patron, let's say, is the fact that architects have the free space to imagine, and we wanted to represent that capacity that architecture has to imagine. And we also have the free space of time, because time is not linear in architecture. We reach to the ancient past and we reach to the future. And I think one of the discoveries that we've made is that architecture by its nature has to be optimistic, because you can't project into the future. And the same is true of urban projects, let's say, is that in the end, to think about the future, you have to be optimistic. And that's what we got back from the participants, was this sense of passion and optimism. And when we were asked to think about this theme, again, just to touch on it, that's one of the things we learned in our own work, that it's the additional space that was not required is what is the glue or the invention of a project, be it in Milan or in Lima, which is like a piece of social infrastructure which makes a different kind of free space to what you would make in a different culture or a different climate, connecting the Pacific Ocean with the city and with the student. Or, as Ricky has said, in the London School of Economics, where we're making unprogrammed space at the ground level where the citizen and the university will meet. And a project we're doing in Dublin at the moment, which is a Dublin City Library, reminds us of how important the institutions of city are, and how the library is one of the few democratic programs and spaces left in our society. And in the Biennale, there is a film in our film program by the documentary maker Fred Wiseman, who made a wonderful film about New York City Library. And we had the pleasure of meeting him on one of our visits to Venice. And he was, being a non-architect, was absolutely astounded at the reality of library, how it empowers people to be together in a space which is free, which is welcoming, and which gives people access to knowledge in an unconditional way. So that these institutions, in many ways, are microcosms of what it is we try to think in your shaping cities in an urban age. It is that issue of the open city, the welcoming place, the democratic city. And when we were thinking about how to curate an exhibition of the scale of Venice, we were all the time trying to make a connection between the city and these venues for the exhibition. And what we absolutely loved about the Corderie is that it is a free space. We saw it empty, and we found that an incredibly strong experience, this 300-meter long space in Venice, but it's also wonderful, full of people. And the only space we could find that we thought was like that exists in Venice, was the temporary bridge built for the Il Redentore, built with the gondolas for, I think, one day. And so we were trying to bring this sense of free space of the city into the venues for the exhibition. And of course, one of the wonderful things about curating an exhibition of this scale is not just there are the challenges, but there's also the enrichment that it brings. And when Raphael Maneo came back with his interpretation of free space, it was a really inspiring piece of text, and we love the kind of little grotto that he has made in the Corderie, with a bench, some text, and his town hall in Murcia. But I'd just like to quote a little bit from him, where he says, "The perception of free space appears at the moment when a building's condition as an artifact gives way, and space is felt as a sensorial expression of freedom, an unalloyed experience where the built work becomes second nature, enabling us without imposing itself. Free space is the greatest achievement a work of architecture can aspire to." And he relates this to his Murcia town hall. And Maneo is a great architect, and he admits that this is, or expresses that this is one of the few moments in his career where he feels he has achieved this sense of the architecture receding and the life taking over. And again, I think Ricky and José and Jean-Louis have already referred to this kind of idea of the space being the primary thing. And it's also interesting listening to you speaking about different modes of practice, and perhaps it's something we'll continue in the conversation later, where Ricky asked you to get off the fence. I mean, the practice of architecture is quite an impure thing. We have morals, we have ambitions, but very often they're silent, and we have to operate within the fields of operation given to us. And that's something, but what we found really interesting is that there are very different modes of practice included in the Biennale, like Lacaton Vassal, for instance, who build in a very rudimentary way, because generosity is their prime goal, and they talk about generosity being to double the space required, to add undetermined volumes. But they also say that when people feel good in them, buildings are beautiful. Architecture then becomes the scene of extended imagination and unexpected sensations. And again, you could say that's the definition of city, that place where people feel welcome and feel have a sense of dignity and have a sense of freedom to be alone, but also to be together. And the way that Lacaton make this evident in their buildings is placing economy as being a very, I suppose, central point, that they release space by being very economical in the way they build. But they also have ways, like in the School of Architecture in Nantes, of bringing ramps from the city to the roof, which sometimes allows bicycles and mobile cinemas to move and make their way through this porous building. And then an alternative to that in terms of the interpretation of free space is Alejandro Aravena from Elemental. And he makes the case that free space should be an active command, really, that it's a verb to free space, and that what's important in the future is as much what we don't build as what we do build. And again, just touching on the growth of cities, he also makes the case that the labor and the resources do not exist in the world to build homes for people in cities at the scale of the growth of cities, and that the role of the architect will be to enable people to build their own homes and to improve their own environments. And one of the things we discovered working in Lima, for instance, is that the cement industry, their biggest buyer is the domestic market, not the commercial market. Because in Peru, the city Lima, for instance, is in a continuous state of growth. People use concrete all the time, and they continue to build and extend their houses. So what Aravena is speaking about, in a way, has already happened, and he's requesting or suggesting that architects become involved in this. Then we have Crimson, the architectural historians, who look at the city from the point of view of immigration. And they make the case that throughout history, cities have been places of freedom and migration, the ultimate free spaces. And they're making a plea for urban planners and architects to really think about how we can make cities as places of welcome. And they also make the case that we're always use, especially I suppose in Europe, the model of the static city, the stable city with a very clear identity, but that cities are unstable and have huge influxes of people coming and going. So their statement, the comings and goings, city of comings and goings, is raising this whole issue about how we can make places of welcome. And the way they make their exhibit is nice, because they use a carpet with the plan of the city on the floor, and so it feels welcoming, it feels soft, and domestic almost. And they use the tool of the Nolli plan of Rome to restate this case that free space and common space and urban space is the key to the life of any city. And what's also interesting is that in terms of how one projects what a city might be, they work in what they call their visualized virtual city, creating a speculative utopian urban image. And almost like a children's storybook, they try to describe in this figurative way what it is they're trying to say that would come from the strategic thinking and the research that goes into their work. And refer to images like, say, in Thomas More's Utopia, the way that it's a bird's eye section, which somehow describes this place that has not yet happened, this utopia, the ability or the wish to visualize it in pictures and not simply in words. But words are also important. They also make this this intervention, which they call the announcement wall, which they say exists in many cities in China, which I haven't seen. And they also refer to announcement walls in Italy, where there are these I suppose scripts describing what's happening in the city, and they make these 6 requests, really. I won't read out all of them. And again, they're very simple questions, but very radical questions. To embed migrants in the heart of the community and the economy, don't band them to its fringes. And in this context, they're very critical of us thinking about migration as being a temporary problem, that it's a permanent problem. The cities are growing, and they call on the architectural and urban planning professions, let's call them, to think about migration, not just in terms of it being a temporary thing. And then moving to Los Angeles, we have Michael Molson, who has made this very interesting project for homeless men for Skid Row. But he talks about that Los Angeles has an abundance of free space, but that leads to the isolation of the individual from the community. And that while they're not trying to import the European city into the American city, they're trying to find ways of making connections between communities within this vast open city. And the way they made their exhibit, again, we feel really represents this thing of scale and the micro and the macro, where they look at the very personalized room of the homeless men and how they occupy it and how people personalize space and at the same time deal with the space of the city. And the project is a very simple one, where they keep the ground floor of an existing block. They make these apartments on a new structure. Prefabricated apartments arrive, and then the space on the roof of the existing building is left as the community and the free space for these men to reconstruct their lives. And again, another interpretation of free space is Rahul Mehrotra Architects, where the title they gave to their exhibit is Soft Thresholds. And they're dealing with the relationship between animals and workers, elephants and workers, the space of the library in the city, and also the office block, which they kind of subvert in a way, which is something we really enjoyed, where this corporate office building, they call it the gardener's catwalk. And there's this vertical garden, which is part of the environmental idea of the office building, which is tended by the workers who are lowest in the hierarchy in this corporate organization, and they work side by side with the more privileged people within the world of the offices. So he's trying to make this kind of social connection by the way that he choreographs the way the building works. And I'll just finish with one quote from him, where he says, Soft thresholds are crucial to the construction of free space. As points of entry and exit, thresholds have a dual coding in society as both physical and symbolic markers of separation and connection. Too often, thresholds divide human activity, and architecture can unwittingly contribute to different forms of separation, especially in ways made visible through interpretations of culture, religion, and legislation. Can architecture and planning intentionally construct soft thresholds, lines that are easily transversed, even temporarily erased, thereby allowing for productive transgressions and multiple perspectives across different modes of practice and social connection? And that sounds like a good city to me. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for pulling together in many ways the intellectual dots, but also to allow us to perhaps go back and revisit some of the exhibits. We know how exhausting it is to go around this large event, but to go back and in a way to test our own mindsets around some of these projects. Before we open up to the floor and conclude in about 20 minutes or so, it seems to me two really important things come out of what you just said, Shelley, and José may want to add to this. One is the issue of scale. I mean, you do talk about this notion of generosity, of freedom of space, which sometimes is access, just access, and other times is view into a world which is much more than we're otherwise able to have access to, and sometimes it's much bigger than that. And I'm interested in this notion of scale, whether it's the facade or the threshold of Raúl Merotra, or why than that. You might want to reflect on that, particularly in the light of your recent conversation with colleagues and friends from Beirut and Lebanon. The other one is a slightly more, very open question about, does all this mean that you have to have an architecture, which you and Yvonne in the end have chosen, if you walk through all the spaces and look at the architecture, of modesty? In order to achieve what you're doing, there is a certain quietness, shall we say. I mean, Raphael Moneo, you could nearly walk through that square and not realize that the building is there. You know what I mean by that. There's a sort of standing back and being deferential to history, to context, to even materials and all that. And I'm interested whether that's, you know, I know your work is not necessarily deferential, but it certainly responds and gives more than perhaps you might have seen on the site. So maybe we can reflect on those two issues of scale and architectural expression, language, practically. José, do you want to just add on my comments, and then Shelley, back to you.
I think there's many ways of looking at the problems of scale, and I'd like to at least separate them into. One of them is in terms of the ambitions of the project. What is a project attempting to do in beyond size? Of course, I focus on the question of size as it relates to let's see, both the historical projects such as the National University, but also in terms of the airport. But to connect it to the notion of, if not modesty, at least I'm looking for another word, at least a notion of specific architectural moves, I think that's where a form of innovation can take place. So to bring up the airport is problematic in two aspects. One of them is taking a 5,000 hectare site. So the question of the architectural object becomes a territorial transformation. And unless we are aware of the impacts that has on space, on the territory, on forests, lakes, or whatever, unless we do that kind of intellectual exercises, we're actually only being as slaves of scale as it relates to size. The other aspect is to what extent you can have an economy of means to do the most with the least possible, in the least possible way. Bucky Fuller had a phrase which is, "Ma'am, do you know how much does your house weigh?" And of course he was interested in these questions of impact on the ground, and sort of it is kind of the grandfather of environment, of ecological footprint. But maybe, as it relates to this exhibition, the question should be, sir or ma'am, do you know what is your project doing in terms of that free space? What is the Bocchioni space achieving socially? What is the Murcia Plaza doing in terms of collective identity? What is the extra in the project doing? And when we collapse the understanding of scale to a notion of size, we miss that capacity to measure other unintended consequences of the project.
Yeah, I don't think it's modesty, actually. I think the point we were trying to make with the Biennale is sometimes it's about modesty and sometimes it's not. And it's about sensitivity to the people and to the place and to the use. And in the end, it's to try and project or imagine what kind of place you're making. That it's not the object, it's sometimes it's the facade. A facade can be a very generous surface. It might just be a facade. Sometimes it's a very strong gesture that's needed to invigorate a place. Sometimes it's monumental, that you need the monumental gesture. We believe in the monument, let's say. We don't just believe in the invisible, but the monument has to feel good and feel that people will want it. And one of the things I was thinking about when you were speaking about the airport was that it sounded to me like the negotiation and the question came too late to the people. That it's not just the resistance to the airport. And actually Crimson have made a fantastic research on the riots in Paris and the riots in London and other riots that have happened in other cities. And the one thing that they discovered is that there was this seething problem going on for years and years where communities felt that something had been imposed on them. Even if it improved their lives, they felt imposed upon. They felt a sense of control and pushing. And that was growing a kind of resistance. And it's interesting sometimes to think about a society like an individual. If you're not invited to the party, you're hurt. You know, if you're always on the outside, you're hurt. And that can build up and build up. And I don't know enough about the project in Mexico, but you said the question came after the event. So, and you must know that timing is one of the secrets of life, that the timing of the right things coming together with the right people is...
How many days do you have to the next election? How many days left do you have to the next election for the mayor of Paris?
The next election is March. It's March 2020. In fact, in Paris, we are lucky because the mandate is 6 years long. So in the US, it's 4 years. What can you do in 4 years in a city? The 2 first years you launch projects, and the 2 last years you are in a campaign, electoral campaign. So I think that the mandate should be longer. And I think that 6 years is okay for a city. Even 7 years could be interesting. Because generally, the people who are inaugurating places are not the people who have launched the project in local governments.
In the end, Shelley, obviously you're taking time in a very different sense than just political mayoral sort of schedules. And you're saying the opportunity you have once to actually give something which over 50 years will give much more back, which I think is a very powerful statement. Can we have the lights up in the auditorium so that we can have some questions from the audience, please? Possiamo mettere le luci nell'auditorio, per favore? Can we have the lights up? Oh, there we go. Thank you very much. So there are microphones coming round. If you don't mind standing up and tell us very briefly who you are. Thank you.
Andy Frew, architect in Belfast. In Belfast, whenever we condition our spaces, we generally heat them or we put roofs over them to keep the rain off. But I noticed that the cities that are growing are all in hot places, and to kind of refrigerate or to cool those buildings to keep them habitable as the planet warms could be a massive challenge. I'm just wondering, had you any thoughts on how the servicing of cities might develop in future as they did in the past with gas and electricity and water? Thank you.
So Stefano Boeri is not here. He would have an answer. But I think José may come to this. And let's have one more question too. There's a question right here at the front.
Hi, my name is Adriana Cobo. I am a researcher in the University of the Arts London and an architect. I actually have two questions. One is for Jean-Louis Missika. I am interested in knowing how the project for Reinventing Paris might or not consider in the long run, post-delivery of the projects, the strategies to manage and to maintain what the project proposes in the long run, say in 1, 2, or 3 decades, which in a way is what gives us the measure of success if we are talking about shifting the focus from form to use. So I would like to, if you may elaborate on that. And the other one is for José. José, in your 4 points about planning, the fourth one that you mentioned is this idea of exceptionality, or how did you call it? Exceptionality. And I'd like to know what you really mean by that, because you mentioned that is this idea that in Latin America we are feeling so exceptional in the ways in which we actually manage the planning of a city, that we don't want to learn from Europe or US models. I don't want to be too proud of my country's examples, but we have a couple of them in which the shaping of the cities, which were done very successfully, were really coming from the local history of planning, actually, from 1991, where power were given to cities. So I am a little bit confused about that one. Thank you.
Can we tackle this first set of questions and then go for another round next in a moment? Go ahead.
I'm still trying to kind of nail down the question of the Belfast, but I'll try to connect it, let's call it, to the thermodynamics of cities in general. And it actually relates to the question of migrants. When you look at cities which are shrinking, whether it is Venice or Detroit, or cities that have, or places in Europe which have limited growth, I think that's where this notion of shaping as a kind of formal or spatial maneuver relates to the shaping as a kind of a social strategy. How can we reimagine those dramatic movements of people and growth that Ricky connected to a more balanced sort of a territorial occupation? Whether this relates to only occupation in terms of people, I mean, do we want to have non-shrinking cities, or do we want to do away with the shrinking cities, or whether it relates to other issues, whether climate change, whether use of resources, whether, as our friend Dan Sujic said, that maybe in 20 years we will be talking about flying 12 hours to a different city as obscene as we talk today about lighting a cigarette in a closed space. This idea of energy as a global system, I think those are questions yet to be tackled, and I don't claim to have an easy answer to them. I mean, the question of exceptionality, Adriana, I think the point I'm trying to make is that in this process of learning curves and learning experiences, and how do we balance innovation, as Jean-Louis mentioned, with adaptation and retrofitting, it is a sensible question. And I don't mean to kind of chastise innovation and uniqueness. There was a moment 25 years ago when a mayor in Curitiba and later a mayor in Bogota decided to invent something new, which was a bus rapid transit system. Of course, we could say that that was also an adaptation of a bus with an adaptation of an idea of a subway. Innovation happens and innovation is important. But I think that to mysticize uniqueness and to think that everyone and every city and every problem is exceptional and unique is sort of corners us into the position of developing solutions where there's already a learning curve in other latitudes and cities and geographies. So we can learn a lot from what Wolfgang Novak called the grammar of success.
Jean-Louis and then Shelley.
Well, to the first question, we have launched a program in Paris called Refreshing the City. And we think that, of course, heat waves and global warming is one of the biggest challenge we will have in the next 20 or 30 years. In fact, we are both working on the refreshment of the public spaces. For example, thanks to Mr. Osman, we have a non-drinking water network in Paris, and we are testing some use of this network in order to refresh the ground during the heat waves. And we also are making some more fountains in the public space in order to refresh. And the biggest challenge, I think, is the refreshing of the buildings. And we are also the chance that we have already a network of cold water pumping in the river, in the Seine. But this network is used only for office buildings and hospitals and places like that. And the next tender we will launch, we will try to extend this service to housing buildings, because we want to avoid what you can see in cities like Los Angeles or others, all these climatizers in each, and we are sure that this is a main risk for the city of Paris, because the last heat wave was at 41 degrees centigrade, so people think about it. To answer the second question about what happens in the long run, it's very difficult to answer a question about the long run, but I will say that we have in the contracts, we have clauses for 10 years about innovation and for 15 years about programmation. But what is more important is that we are asking architects and developers to create more flexible and more reversible buildings. We want the buildings, the building can be used not only for their first purpose, but for reuse in terms of, for example, transforming an office building in a housing building. And I think that on the question of programmation, it's very difficult to go beyond 15 years, because things are changing so quickly. 5 years ago, everybody, even the most inventive architect, could believe that co-working spaces were only marginal in the office industry. And now we see that it is the future of the office buildings. And co-housing is rising very quickly. And we understand that users are moving quicker than building and the lasting of buildings. This is why temporary architecture and flexible architecture is so important. And by the way, in our system of Reinventing Paris, we have an appointment each year with the developer in order to see the problems of the innovation, because of course some innovation will fail. This is the risk, and we assume the risk, but we have to deal with this problem of failure of innovation which doesn't work, and we have also to be flexible and accept some change in the project as far as the project is still a general interest project.
If Paolo Baratta were here, he would probably comment, simply because we were talking about it yesterday, about everything to do with longer term, in the end revolves around the notion of an infrastructure which is adaptable, and the notion of a building or a city as a loft. It's that simple. So we don't know what's going to happen, but let's happen. Not unlike these buildings, which were designed for very different purposes to make ropes, and they're pretty good for exhibitions.
One word more about greening the building. So we have a program of 100 hectares of vegetalization of the roofs and facades, and among these 100 hectares, 30 hectares of agriculture, urban agriculture. So I think that, for example, a building, if you have a good vegetalization of the building, you can lower the temperature between 2 and 4 degrees during the heat waves. It's very important to do that.
Maybe one or two more questions. So, gentleman over there and lady down here.
My name is Fabio, and I'm studying architecture at the University of Bath. And my question is, to what extent is the solution to all these problems that you outlined, to what extent can the solution come from the inclusion of architects and urbanists in the political sphere and in the lawmaking sphere? Thank you.
And, here, and then the gentleman over there.
Thank you. I am Antonella Contin from Politecnico di Milano. My question is about SDGs.
About?
SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals. We spend a lot of time in Quito and in Kuala Lumpur speaking about SDGs, but it seems that for architects are not so relevant as a tools to transform our city and our architecture. What do you think about SDGs and the framework that right now are related to SDGs as a tool also for thinking about new buildings and new cities? I would like to say to shape the city in a metropolitan age, much more than an urban age. Thank you.
Just to clarify, SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, which is what the United Nations and other agencies have set in terms of making cities and society and the world in general more inclusive, more green, etc., etc. And there's a very specific SDG, number 11, which refers to many of the issues that we've been talking about and supposedly are being adopted by nations across the world. And I'm sure José will tell us how difficult that is to implement. Gentleman over there, one more question.
Approfitto delle gentilissime traduttrici, parlo in italiano, se non vi dispiace. Sono un architetto veneziano, mi chiamo Carlo Zago.
Un attimo.
Certo. Ripeto, sono un architetto veneziano, mi chiamo Carlo Zago. E niente, volevo porre una domanda a tutti voi, un po' anche provocatoria, così tanto per concludere. Da che parte sta? Cioè, era interessante la domanda che faceva Ricky su da che parte stai, no? Cioè, bisogna prendere un po' la parte. Allora, qui è un po' difficile intenderci tra le lingue, tra le culture d'origine, tra le prospettive per il futuro, eccetera. E quindi all'interno delle nostre discussioni noi siamo sempre diciamo incerti, no? Se far prevalere il termine, sono 3 termini nei quali diciamo, giochiamo con queste 3 carte, il gioco delle 3 carte, ed è città, ovviamente, che deriva da civitas, urban, urbano, che deriva da urbs, e politica, che è la polis. No? E ci sono questi 3 aspetti che vengono sempre giocati e mescolati un po' alla bisogna, no? Come dei giocatori appunto del giochetto delle 3 carte che inganna sempre qualcuno, no? Allora, da che parte state su questa triplice, su questo tripode, insomma, su cui tutti quanti balliamo un po', no? Per fare i nostri vaticini, come la pizia.
So if we take is it clear? No. If we take the city, or broadly, the city is civitas, the collective, the urban, and the political, polis, where do you stand in interpreting the city or facing action? So we have 3 questions. Why don't you all 3 pick one area you want to respond, and then we might conclude. So.
If you don't mind, I prefer to pick the one about sustainable goals. In Paris, we have decided to transform these general goals in specific rules in our local urban planning, le PLU, le plan local d'urbanisme. We try to design a set of rules. The first one is we want architects and developers to keep all the buildings which can be kept. I mean that demolition and rebuilding is one of the worst way of rebuild a city. So we have to renovate always when it's possible. And it's very often more possible than people imagine. For example, in Paris, we have decided that garages have to be renovated and not destroyed to make housing, because it's possible. And if it's possible, we have to do it, because the ecological footprint of a demolition is a disaster. The second rule is re-employment. You say re-employment? To reuse, the reuse of the materials. And also the rule is all the materials which can be reused have to be reused. Because you know, like me, that, for example, the sand to make concrete is in shortage, and now they are going to take the sand in the oceans, and it's a disaster for the ocean ecology. And the third rule is using biosourced materials instead of concrete. I think that we have to get out of the concrete exactly as we have to get out of the diesel and the thermic power engine. And as far as the city of Paris have announced that we are get out of the diesel in 2024 and get out of the power engine in 2030, we are going to announce that we are going to get out of the concrete in 2030. So I think that we need to understand the emergency situation and the fact that the constructing industry is one of the more polluting in the planet. And there are solutions. We can get rid of this kind of pollution.
If I try and, I think, interpret part of the polemical side of your question, is that are these things useful for a politician, for a city leader? These very broad, generic ambitions. You're actually saying yes.
Yes, of course. We are using this kind of
Right.
prescriptions as a help in order to design our local obligations and recommendations.
Jose?
I will actually connect the three questions, which has to do with a kind of an architect in training, someone interested in the policy and how it affects change, and this tripartite of the urbis, the polis, and the civitas. I'm less concerned with, let's call it intellectual and design monogamy. In other words, the idea that we have to pick our position in one particular part of the board, but rather how we can do kind of a transversal section between the legal and the political, between the policy and the design, between the urbis and the civitas. Sometimes we play as citizens, and sometimes we play as policymakers. What I would think matters, and I will put a parallel case to the SDGs, which is the Cleaner Act in 1973, where you have a strong form of regulation producing forms of innovation from the car industry. So sometimes it's about the carrots, and sometimes it's about the sticks. The SDGs require to have a level of engagement and embrace which is, on the one hand, deeper rather than ambiguous from the professional realm, especially the architects, who usually don't give a shit about them, but actually find the way to connect them from the pedagogy of architecture to the political act of being an urbanist. I do think it is possible to be simultaneously concerned about the urbis, in other words, kind of the Cerdà understanding of how do we design cities, with the civitas. I mean, what's the relationship between the cities and the citizens, as much as with the political act of being an architect. So I reclaim that multi-tier right of being polygamous rather than monogamous.
Yeah, I agree. And actually, one of the other things that occurs to me is that it tends to be promoted among young architects that there's only one way of practicing architecture. And I think it's really important that the next generations rethink this. For instance, a number of years ago, Rem Koolhaas showed the work of civil servants in, the work of architects in public bodies. And fantastic work that they're doing. And there's young architects in London now who are what you might call infiltrating the local authorities to become local authority architects, not just private practice. And that was a system that existed in the post-war London, which was fantastically progressive. So I think that's really important. And yesterday at a meeting about the Lebanon Pavilion was a mayor of a small town who was also an architect, and he was promoting with his students that they get involved in politics. So in order to grow people who will be in positions of power, let's say, and strategic thinking that will be implemented, I think architects need to think about all the different ways of practice. And in relation to global warming, it really does, I think, and climate change, it really does come back to us and our conscience. We use a lot of concrete, and we've also been looking at the issue of sand and realizing how it has no future, really, in terms of thinking about the future. And not to go on about Lacaton Vassal, but they speak at length about working with clients for a year, maybe more, to convince them to use a light switch instead of a computerized system, and to convince them to spend money on, instead of mechanical plant, to make an 8-meter high room instead of a 4-meter high room. So it's how to bring imagination and thinking to bear at all of the different levels, which I think is what you're saying. And it reminds me of a quote by Alvaro Siza, which is that architects are specialists in non-specialization, that there is nothing that doesn't affect architecture, and that's the way that we we have to think. But I think the thing of the change of attitude, we were really shocked when we went to Lima to find a whole series of glass buildings in relation to the question about heating, because everybody in Lima wants a New York skyscraper. And we found that you don't need that because it's a moderate climate and one can think about building in a completely different way, which we found very liberating. But they're trying to make buildings which are air conditioned, and we found ourselves wearing jumpers in these really cool spaces that were highly air conditioned. So it's a whole attitude, a change of attitude. And I love the way you're talking about the users are moving more quickly than, I can't remember what you said, technology or the market or whatever, where people are actually getting to the point where they don't want to live in a certain way anymore, and that's something that's really encouraging. When you deal with estate agents who tell you that you can only provide a certain kind of space to make a certain kind of amount of money, that needs to be challenged continually, and it's not the case. It's the non-imaginative components in society which generate a lot of the promotion of these problems.
Thank you very much to all three of you and for your questions. It's coming up to 5 o'clock, so I think we should begin to draw the event to a close. Clearly, in a moment, we want to thank our three speakers, but I just want to reflect on a challenge, I think, which comes from the room here to Philip Rode, myself, and those involved at LSE Cities with the Alfred Herhausen Gesellschaft, that I think we need to come up with a matrix measuring free space from now on. I think it has to be alongside sustainability, mobility, and other things. I mean that in a way seriously, that to re-energize also the debate about the future of the cities as in terms of the three major dimensions that were talked about. The notion of imagination is very, very powerful. There is a risk in these discussions to be very technocratic and solution-orientated, and to provide that space seems to be fundamental. And I have to say, Yvonne and Shelley's poetic vision shines through in some of the projects that come through. And that is also a way of reminding ourselves of how powerful and important an institution like the La Biennale di Venezia is, with all the complexities of being supported by the state, the region, and the city, that it actually offers this opportunity to many of us over decades to put forward effectively agendas which can be discussed out in the open. As you know, this book is the summary of our own agenda at LSE Cities. Philip and I, as editors, supported and shaped, I'm nearly going to say, by Megan Groth at the beginning of this publication, have tried to bring in a number of the major themes, what we've talked about today, in terms of, let's call it the politics, the governance, the issue of communal space, the major challenges at the different scales that José has also talked about that face his city, and what we've heard from Shelley in terms of the need to be more creative, actually, and to give more back than is actually given to you in the brief and the program is significant. I think we want to do more in whatever work we can do in our publication. But I'm going to end with a plug. Please go and buy the book, because it's over there. But thank you to the speakers, thank you to the Biennale, and all those who have supported us. Thank you very much.